Okay, now let's turn to look at pragmatism and what that movement taught in isolation. Like I said, it's a distinctly American-made philosophy that began with Charles Sanders Peirce and was continued by William James and John Dewey. Peirce's radical empiricism led to a kind of a skepticism, very similar to Hume's skepticism. But a new theory of truth began to emerge, and that is that truth evolves as humans experience the world in an ever-progressing and changing way. So the world is in flux and changing, and therefore what you call truth has to kind of just roll with that and change and adapt with it. Old things that you thought were true, they may have been true in the past, but they're no longer true because the world has gone on and changed, okay? So this is a kind of a perspectivism as well. Remember, we talked about perspectivism with Nietzsche and his idea, and he had different motivations for his perspectivism, but this too kind of buys into this kind of a murky epistemology here where things are ever shifting and changing. This also encourages a kind of a pluralism of ideas, and the idea that everyone has a different perspective and every society operates within a kind of a deep web of deep isolated or deep-seated interests that govern how they see the world. So for the pragmatists, the way that any one individual or a society or a culture sees the world and the way they interpret it is simply something that serves deep-seated interests and drives to flourish and to do well in the society and to progress. And we don't really understand what's going on down there. And so we don't really see the world as it is. We simply interpret it in a way that's going to help us get along and to help us to do well, okay? So there are nearly innumerable motivations that operate deep below in our consciousness and in our rational minds that are driving us to see the world in a certain way. Okay, so we don't really see it the way it is. We see it in a way that will help us to get along and do well. Our highest interest as individuals in society silently operate underneath, deep down inside of our consciousness and so forth. And we want to flourish and prosper, to be happy, to live a long and good life. And so all of these things, these interests such as career, family relations, social networks, class, race, education, politics, economics, all of these things are interests that are driven by these deep desires to go on and to do well. So you see all these macro issues that I've just mentioned that are so important to people are powered by deeper interests to flourish. And so flourish, survive, you get the idea. This is kind of a Darwinian notion. We all want to survive and flourish as individuals and as a culture, as a society. So all of that, we embrace what works for us. And hence you can see the connection here to the pragmatic value. What is pragmatic? In other words, what is it that works and gets stuff done? This is a very American way of thinking, by the way. At some point, I mean, there are some oversimplifications of pragmatism that you would often hear, such that, well, truth is that which works. Kind of, yeah, that is an oversimplification. But truth, we're not so much concerned about absolute truth. We just want to get the job done. And I don't care whether it's true or not. Did it work? That's kind of the, brought down to the street level, if you will, the way pragmatism is often looked at. Personally, we make all kinds of daily decisions to do things that function toward one another of these long-term interests that we have. Okay, so you may go to school for a very long time to prepare yourself. Why? Well, you want to flourish and you want to do well. Okay, and so a lot of our personal interests are driven by the outcome. And you can even see this in education, the whole idea of outcome-based education, and the whole culture of assessments that we now have in education. And that's not just in education, it's in all realms of society. Did you achieve the outcome that you desired? And have you assessed that to see? And if you did not, then go back and change what you did so that you will attain or reach those assessments. It's the outcome, it's the consequence that we're concerned with. Hence, this whole school of pragmatism is also often called consequentialism. Okay? So Dewey insists that theory in philosophy must always be secondary to practice. It's not theory practice, it's practice then develop your theory based upon your practice, you see. So practice rules, practice is primary, and theory is simply not all that important. They should be unified, but theory should kind of be built out of and be an extrapolation from practice, not the other way around. So practice and experience drive progress and therefore drive how we educate students. This can't help but impose a kind of empirical epistemology on things. If you're working from the world of practice, then you have to observe, and you have to make a lot of observations. It has to be empirical and so forth. And so this radical empirical approach is the outworking of these pragmatic philosophers of Peirce and James and Dewey. So education must aim for an empiricist approach to all questions and problems, just the way science does. Okay, now we've looked at his worldview, we've looked at the pragmatic school of philosophy. Now let's turn to his philosophy of education. As I've said, Dewey is most famous for his educational theory, his practice and reforms, and he sets the stage for much of 20th century American education. He's not the only thinker, and obviously there are plenty of other thinkers who've contributed to American educational theory, but he's one of the heavy hitters. Behind every curriculum and every educational methodology, there lies some type of philosophy, a philosophy of education, which entails a view of what a human being is and what a human being needs to do, okay? There's a philosophical view of what is right and what is wrong, what is moral, what is not moral. There's a view of society, that is, how human beings should be organized together, okay? And ultimately, there's a view of what is finally real in the world. Now, that one's usually pretty buried and deeply hidden, but these ideas about the world are buried, are present, at least, in every philosophy of education. And Dewey is no different. We can see his worldview working itself out in his philosophy of education. And it intertwines with his views of everything else in a kind of an organic way. So, his theory and practice of education is meant to be a kind of organic union and inseparable. His theory is his practice. Again, his theory came out of his practice, not the other way around. He wants to see tangible results that are measurable. And it kind of gets to this idea that, well, if you can't measure the outcomes, then you need to rethink what you're doing. Everything needs to be measurable, okay? The needs of a society also outweigh the needs of the individual. He wants to balance the individual and society in education. In other words, this is kind of like there's this tension between the individual student and the curriculum. And how much does the curriculum override the individual? Well, a lot of Dewey's students and people who incorporated Deweyan ideas started to emphasize the individual over the curriculum, to give the individual more preference, more freedom, if you will, in the educational experience. And so Dewey kind of tries to step back in and correct that and bring them back into balance. But this balance is very hard to even define what it is or how to achieve it. But he wants to keep, you know, the curriculum that is a fixed, you know, program of study in balance with the needs of the individual. So societal concerns, though, ultimately have to trump the individual freedom and advancement, because, look, you're going out into a democratic world, and therefore you kind of have to fall into a democratic mode of operation in the educational establishment, okay? So commenting on the province and the office of the teacher, Dewey maintains that because the development of experience comes about through interaction, it is essentially a social process. The teacher, as the most mature member of the group, has a peculiar responsibility for the conduct and the interactions and intercommunications which are the very life of the group as a community. And since for Dewey, experience lies at the heart of the educational process, he declares that a sound philosophy of education depends upon a sound philosophy of experience. And so that is pretty much encapsulates a lot of his ideology about how we're to educate. So for Dewey, education must ground itself in experiences, and experiences must be the basis for learning, for knowing, because the world is ever changing, and there is no knowledge or truth that transcends all experiences of the world. So this fluctuating world demands that we learn how to learn as it shifts around us. This means that we must root all learning in direct experience of our environment, of our social world, economic world, political, and natural world. You may remember the ancient philosopher Heraclitus, who one day was standing next to a river, and he told his students that you could never step into the same river twice because the river was constantly changing. And Cratylus was one of his students standing there, and he corrected his teacher, and he said, no, teacher, you cannot even step into the same river once. As soon as you step into the river, it's changing. All the water's flowing down, different particles, debris. You get the idea. The banks are changing. Everything's in flux. And so it is with the whole world. Aristotle tells us this story in Metaphysics. Fundamentally, Dewey's ideas kind of agree with that. Because the world is ever in flux, you can't know for sure anything that transcends that flux. And so your knowledge has to ever change. And it's based on the experience right now, and we cannot derive any timeless transcendent truth from it. His influence in the field of education still carries a lot of significant weight in the world, though he's not as significant as he used to be. Many other people have come along and changed the whole theories of education and so forth. But the tilt in the direction of the mainstream American public education, at least, could be characterized as Deweyan due to the progressive emphasis on the technical and pragmatic training for the actual organic kind of society that one will enter into when they step out the door, of education. His practical pedagogy incorporates the psychology of childhood development, trying to synchronize lessons with the child's age. So this idea that you have to have age-appropriate type of knowledge and lessons and so forth is something that he embraced and promoted. He also emphasized that education must correspond to the cultural context of the child. Now, you look at the time that he lived in. He lived in late 19th century as America was moving out of an agrarian culture into an industrial culture. And so by the time he reaches the end of his life, 1952, we're already up into the nuclear age. And so he's seeing great shifts and changes in technology and society. But if you reflect upon it now, where the position that we're in now as a society, things are even changing more rapidly. We live in a world where technological revolutions and so forth, happen on a 5-year scale, not on a generational scale anymore of 20 or more years. We have technological revolutions that change fundamental things, the way we interact and the way we do things, very rapidly. And so what he would argue is, really, you've got to prepare children for those shifts and changes in society. So schools must reflect all this change. And he was trying to prepare students to enter the industrial age, because the agrarian age was quickly going away at that time. So we're not just teaching children subject matter, we have to teach them a subject matter as it relates directly to those societal changes and shifts, So schools must integrate pedagogy with industrial culture in a kind of two-directional interchange. It's kind of a cycle. Industrial culture drives education and subject material for him in that time, and schools must teach children what can be applied just outside the schoolyard on the other side of the street. Okay? So he fully incorporates William James' philosophy or pedagogy based upon the psychology of the mind. A child's mind is just a function of social life, held James. It's not an independent thing that finds timeless truths. It's not like this Platonic idea of the mind that was at one time associated with some kind of otherworldly essences, and then you came into this world and somehow forgot those essences because of your body in the material world, and now your mind has to reconnect with that. For these guys, that is extraordinarily passé way of thinking about things. The mind is really a socially organic type of consciousness. It's not independent. In other words, my view of myself is something that is situated within a social context. So it isn't a store of knowledge and information and ideas either. Rather, we're more emotional and interactive in the way we think in the world. And so the way we deal with the world is, for James at least, much more pragmatic and organic than it is some kind of transcendent, theoretical, and finding these timeless truths. So the functionalist idea of the mind overrides the idea of the mind as a knower of concepts and ideas. Dewey thus maintained that education must train a child's mind via experiences again, not memory of facts, not knowing information, and not unexperienced absolute truths. So teachers have to somehow or another actively balance between two poles and avoid the extremes. At one extreme, the curriculum becomes like a Procrustean bed, a kind of rigid system that forces all children through a kind of strict mold, and everyone comes out the same. At the other extreme, though, you have education that goes towards the child's self-expression and spontaneity, and whatever the child wants kind of overrides all subject matter, and the individual overpowers the curriculum. So Dewey wanted to kind of balance these out, and saw that only in the balancing them out could you attain, the highest levels of education.